Part 2 of the Epilogue to After the Divorce by Grazia Deledda, translated by Maria Hornor Lansdale. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Denham. That same evening, Uncle Isidoro reasoned with Constantino at length, urging him by every argument at his command to avert what otherwise must inevitably result in a catastrophe for himself, for Giovanna, and for everyone concerned. Constantino regarded the old man steadily with his usual melancholy smile. "What," he demanded, "could happen? You admit yourself that the old harpy will never talk to her son. And isn't she my wife, Giovanna? Haven't I a perfect right to be with her whenever I choose?" "Ah, child of the Lord," sighed Isidoro, clasping his hands and shaking his head, "you will be made to suffer for it in some way. You had better look out. Martina Dejas is capable of anything where her son is concerned." A look of hatred came into Constantino's eyes. "Listen," he said, "my heart is like a vessel full of deadly poison. A single drop more and it will overflow. Let them look out who have brought all this on themselves." Then he got up and went out into the night. For hours he wandered aimlessly about, like one who had lost his way in the wind-swept solitude. Then, about midnight, he found himself, almost without knowing how he got there, as on that first evening, beneath Giovanna's window. He climbed on the shed and tapped. Aunt Martina, lying wakeful and alert, heard everything. Heard Constantino approach, heard his knock, heard Giovanna open to him, and then she knew it was hopeless. Without doubt, Isidoro had faithfully reported his conversation with her, and this was Constantino's reply. He had come directly and defiantly to Giovanna. "No doubt," thought the old woman bitterly, "he argues that since old Martina lacks the courage to make her son unhappy by telling him the truth, he may as well profit by her weakness. Yes, no doubt that is what he thinks. But he has forgotten to take account of what the poor old mother may be stirred up to do in order to protect her boy. Now, Constantino Ledda, it is between us two." One night, as Constantino slid down from the shed beneath Giovanna's window, he felt something cold and sharp enter his side. In the darkness he made out the figure of a man, his face covered with a black cloth. He threw himself upon him, and after a brief struggle, breathless, silent, determined, he succeeded in throwing him down and disarming him. Then he let him go without so much as attempting to identify him. What did it signify who the assassin was? Behind that black mask he knew only too well that Aunt Martina's gaunt features looked out, and that it was her hand that had directed the murderous stroke. He made his way back to Isidoro's hut, and the fisherman, being absent on one of his journeys, dressed the wound himself, hiding away like a stricken animal, and concealing what had happened from everyone. He did not even undress, but for 3 days and nights lay stretched on his pallet, a prey to the bitterest reflections. The weather had become cold. Outside, the wind whistled among the dry hedges, and forcing its way into the hut, made the long threads of cobweb swing back and forth, and brought down clouds of dust from the roof. Through the window Constantino could see processions of pale blue clouds scudding across the cold bright background of the sky, and he said to himself that he wanted to die. Death! Death! What else remained for him? The world, his world, was now only a cold and empty void. His feeling for Giovanna could never be what it once had been. He had indeed resumed his relations with her, but she could never mean the same thing to him again after having deserted him in his hour of need. The very pleasure which he felt in their clandestine intercourse was due in part to his hatred of the Dejases. The Dejases! The mere thought of the joy which his death would afford them even now aroused him and put new life into his veins. They have stolen everything else of mine, he thought, and now they want to take my life as well. But they shan't have it. I will kill one of them first. He recalled a trial at which he had once been present, where the accused had proved that he had been attacked and had struck back in order to defend himself. The jury had acquitted him. Well, they will acquit me. I shall be striking in self-defence. And if they don't acquit me... There arose before him the faces of his fellow convicts. The King of Spades smiled at him lugubriously, and behind him he could see the gloomy walls of the prison courtyard. At least, though, they had been friendly. They might have been murderers, but they had never tried to assassinate him. On the third day of his seclusion in Uncle Isidoro's hut, a storm came up. Nothing could exceed the comfortless desolation of the poor little abode. The black clouds travelling overhead seemed to break directly against the small, bare window. Presently some big drops fell from the roof, one leak in especial, directly over the black cold fireplace, was so persistent that at last, seeing that the water was forming into a thin stream, the young man reached out and shoved Uncle Isidoro's earthenware saucepan beneath it. Drip, drip, drip. The sound was like the monotonous and melancholy ticking of a clock. Night descended, if anything colder and more dreary than before. The rain came down steadily, and the drops fell into the saucepan with the regularity of a machine. Constantino did not move. He had neither wood wherewith to build a fire, nor any more food, and it did not occur to him to get up, to bestir himself, to go out, to live. Perhaps Uncle Isidoro was stalled in some neighbouring village by the storm, and would not get back. During the night, fever set in, and Constantino was racked by hideous dreams, painful memories of the past, tempests of anger mingled with physical suffering. How long he lay in this condition he could never remember, only he recollected hearing the steady drip, drip of the water as it fell into the saucepan, the beating of the rain on the roof, and the long sob of the wind as it swept about the deserted house. In the intervals of the fever, when he would arouse from the lethargy that weighed him down, he was conscious of sharp shooting pains through all his limbs, similar to those he had felt in prison on awaking after a feverish night, and also of a savage animal desire to do some harm, to fling himself on someone or something, and bite, and tear, and destroy. Another day and night went by. The rain was falling more heavily than ever, and that steady, inexorable drip, drip had at last filled and overflowed the saucepan. Between cold and starvation, Constantino had almost come to the end of his forces. Once he was visited by a horrid illusion. He thought that a mad dog had thrown him down and bitten him in the stomach. He awoke shaking and could not throw the idea off. Perhaps he had been bitten by a mad dog, and this was hydrophobia. Towards evening the storm died down, though the rain did not cease entirely. Then suddenly he felt that he was dying. He had no sense of rebellion now. All that was over. He seemed to have lost even the power to care. To die, to die. Why should he want to go on living? Everything, both within him and about him, was black and void. Through all his fever-ridden dreams, one idea had remained persistently by him: that he was about to commit a crime. Now it was Aunt Martina whom he was on the point of stabbing, then someone else. But in the intervals of consciousness he realized that should he live, should he once more find himself burdened with the dolorous gift of existence, while he would not even attempt to resist the secret force that was urging him on, it would matter little against whom his fury expended itself. It might be Aunt Martina, or Brontu, or someone else. But then, deep down in his soul, he could never rid himself of a sense of terror of what would happen afterwards. Yes, he wanted to die, so as to suffer no more, and to be saved from becoming a murderer. At last the rain was ceasing. It still fell steadily, but more now like a gentle shower, while the wind had died down completely. It was cold, though, and the damp, chill atmosphere hung over the cabin like a heavy, wet cloth. So unutterably dreary were the weather and the surroundings that Constantino, recalling the periods of his most acute misery, could never remember being so utterly and hopelessly wretched as now. Not even on the day of the sentence, not even on the day when they had told him of the divorce, nor on that other day of his return. For on every one of those occasions, desperate as the outlook had been, there always remained the hope of better things in the life to come. Then his conscience had been pure, but now, should he go on living, he believed that he would surely forfeit all hope in the life to come. At times, goaded by this horror, he would cry aloud, imploring death to come and save him, as a terrified child cries for its mother. Thus the hours wore on. He had dropped into a feverish sleep, but awoke suddenly, trembling with terror at he could not tell what. The rain was over at last, but in the profound stillness that enwrapped him, Constantino fancied that he still heard it beating on the roof, and the drip, drip from the leak over the fireplace, only now the sound seemed to come from far, far away, from a world that was already remote. He thought that he was already dead, or lingering on the extremest confines of life, in a place of shadows, of silence, of mystery. What would he find there, just beyond? The light of eternity, or the darkness of eternity? He was afraid to open his eyes. He tried to cry out, but could not utter a sound. Then a knock came on the door. The sound dragged him back from that vague tide on which he was floating. He opened his eyes without moving, conscious both of relief and regret at finding himself still alive. The knocking was repeated louder than before. Who could it be? Not Uncle Isidoro, he would have called out. Constantino neither stirred nor spoke. Possibly he had not the strength to get up, but in any case he had no wish to. Why must they come to disturb him, dragging him back from those mysterious shores on which he had almost set foot? Meanwhile the knocking continued still more vigorously, but after a little it ceased, and everything became perfectly still. A short time elapsed. Then someone again approached the hut. Presently the end of a stout stick was thrust under the door, serving as a lever. The frail barrier, secured only by a metal hasp, quickly yielded, and the figure of a woman, with a skirt thrown over her head and shoulders, appeared for a moment in the opening. Stepping inside, she turned and replaced the rickety door before Constantino was able to recognize her. There was a moment of breathless silence, during which he could hear his visitor groping her way about in the pitchy darkness on the other side of the hut. Then she spoke, and he recognized the voice of Aunt Bacchisia. "Constantino, are you there? Where are you? Are you dead or alive? Why don't you answer? Someone said you had not been seen for 3 days, and that Isidoro Pani was away. I came once before and knocked, but you wouldn't answer. What's the matter? Are you sick?" Still he made no reply, burying his face like a sulky child. "My soul!" moaned the woman. "My soul!" moaned the woman. "He must be ill as well." "As well? Then someone else was ill? Who?" he wondered. "Perhaps Giovanna." He listened intently, still keeping his face covered. "He has no fire and no light," she muttered. "What does it all mean? Wait, I'll strike a light. Where are my matches?" The pale blue flame of a sulphur match shot up for a moment, and then suddenly died away. Constantino could see nothing, but he heard Aunt Bacchisia stumbling her way towards him, moaning, "Constantino! Constantino!" A wave of anger swept over him. He tried to cry out, to rise and fling himself upon her, choke her, but he was powerless. A cold sweat broke out all over him, and he knew that if he attempted so much as to speak, he would burst into tears. How hatefully weak he was! Aunt Bacchisia struck another match and began searching for a light of some sort, but all she could find was a rude iron lamp hanging on a nail, with neither wick nor oil. Then she groped her way to the fireplace, and stooping down, held out her hand with the lighted match between her fingers. There were the saucepan full of water, the heap of wet ashes, the soaked hearthstone, and beyond, half in the circle of light, the figure of Constantino extended motionless on the pallet. The match flared up and then went out, and all became again perfectly dark and silent. For a moment Aunt Bacchisia did not stir. She hardly seemed to breathe. Then a long, choking sob broke from her. Of what had she been thinking in that moment of silence and darkness? Did that vision of Constantino lying apparently dead before her awaken a sudden agonizing sense of what she had done, of her iniquitous responsibility in the ruin that had been wrought in Giovanna's and Constantino's lives, and in the lives of everyone concerned in the melancholy drama? Throwing herself on the floor beside the pallet, she passed her hands tremblingly over his body and face, sobbing in the darkness and silence. "Constantino! Constantino! Are you alive? Answer me." "Yes," she murmured presently, "he is alive, but ill, ill. You are ill, aren't you?" she went on coaxingly. "Is it a wound? Ah, God, if you only knew what terrible things have happened. Giovanna sent me. She was frightened, you know. She thought you might have been hurt, that someone might have been lying in wait for you. She's more dead than alive herself, Constantino." At last Constantino gave a moan. Something hard in his breast seemed to melt. He was moved, affected. Then he was not forgotten after all. Giovanna had been anxious. She had sent to find out about him. She was frightened, unhappy. Then, in his changed mood, Aunt Bacchisia's words of a moment before came back to him with fresh meaning. "He is ill as well," she had said. Who was this other person who was ill? Again he thought of Giovanna, and his heart sank. "Is it a wound?" she repeated. "Yes," murmured Constantino. "Who did it?" "I don't know. Someone hired by Aunt Martina Dejas." "Ah!" cried Aunt Bacchisia, her voice thick with anger. Then, in a changed tone, she said, "The saying goes that God does not pay on Saturday. Well, Brontu Dejas is dying, poor wretch." Constantino felt as though an electric shock had gone through him. He started to his feet, swayed, and fell back on his knees. In the darkness his hands encountered those of Aunt Bacchisia, and she felt that they were scorching hot and trembling. "Constantino, my soul!" she cried, alarmed lest in his weak and exhausted condition the shock of her news had been too great for him. "Constantino, what is it? You are shaking all over like a little kid." "Yes, Brontu is very ill. He came back yesterday. It was a holiday, you know, and he came home so drunk that he was like something crazy. It seems that he has been drinking all the time lately, even up at the sheepfolds. So then yesterday, when he came in, he was horribly drunk, and he began quarrelling with his mother and Giovanna and tried to beat them. They were so frightened that they ran up and locked themselves in their rooms. Brontu stayed down in the kitchen, and he must have stretched himself out alongside the fire. After some time they heard him crying out, but they thought it was just some drunken foolishness, and did not go down to see what it was. After a while, though, when he had become quiet, Aunt Martina went and found him lying there, unconscious and frightfully burned. He had evidently fallen asleep, and had put his legs right over the fire, and then his clothing caught. There was an empty brandy bottle lying beside him. He hasn't come to since, and the doctor says he can't live through the night. Poor Brontu. He wasn't bad. He was weak, but not really bad. Constantino, Constantino, what on earth is it? What are you doing?" For in the darkness, Aunt Bacchisia, who had told her story with moans and sighs of sympathy, partly for Constantino, partly for Brontu, heard what she at first took to be a burst of insane laughter. The young man's hands became rigid, his limbs contracted, and for one wild moment she thought he had lost his reason. Then the truth broke upon her. He was crying, weeping bitterly, half from weakness and reaction, but half too from horror and sympathy at the awful ending of a man whom, but a short while before, he had thought that he hated so much that he was in danger of killing him. That same night Brontu died, and some time later Giovanna and Constantino were reunited. Old Aunt Martina, absorbed in her grief and completely shattered by it, like an oak tree that has been struck by lightning, offered no objection, but neither did she forgive the young people, and she demanded that the little Marietta should be left under her care. Thus the two, the old woman and the child, lived on in the White House, while Giovanna and Constantino returned to the little grey cottage. There, after a time, another child was born to them, Malfineddu. It is a soft spring day. Overhead the sky is a tender blue, and all around the village the fields of grain sway like the waves of a green encircling sea. Aunt Martina sits on the portico, spinning and praying silently, a white, tragic figure, spiritualized by sorrow. Aunt Patricia sits spinning likewise before the door of the cottage. Giovanna is sewing, and hard by, Constantino works at his bench. No one speaks, but the thoughts of all are turned on the past. In the middle of the common, Marietta and Malfineddu are playing together with gurgles and shouts of joyous laughter, as happy and unconcerned as the birds on the neighbouring hedges. Hither and thither they go, trotting from Aunt Martina to Constantino, from Aunt Patricia to Giovanna, from Giovanna to Aunt Martina, and each in turn, even the desolate, heartbroken old grandmother, looks up to receive them with a smile of tender indulgence. They are the invisible woof of peace and mutual forgiveness. End of the Epilogue. Recording by Tom Denham. End of After the Divorce by Grazia Deledda. Translated by Maria Hornor Lansdale.